And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft as we approach the top of the next hour. Almost 5 o'clock here on the West Coast, almost 8 o'clock there in Washington. We're getting some breaking news regarding President Trump's sweeping tariff policies here. The Washington Post has it. Take a look at this. That the Court of International Trade ruled today that President Trump exceeded his authority in imposing tariffs on all imported goods. The president invoked a 1977 law that granted him emergency powers over the economy. So the ruling, this is from a 3-judge panel. This is a New York-based court. It's called the Court of International Trade. And as you know, it came after several lawsuits arguing Trump has exceeded his authority. It left U.S. trade policy dependent on his whims and unleashed economic chaos. So the court wrote this, referring to that law in 1977. It's known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. They wrote this, that the worldwide and retaliatory tariff orders exceed any authority granted to the president by IEEPA to regulate importation by means of tariffs. Now, the White House did not immediately respond to a message seeking comment to the Associated Press. The Trump administration, though, is expected to appeal. Now, remember, some weeks ago, we brought you word that many, especially Democratic state attorneys general, had filed suit in this very body with this outcome in mind. And it does seem like they got somewhat of a reprieve here with the rationale that many of the tariff policies were hurting the economies of their states. Now, at least 7 lawsuits are challenging the levies. These are really the centerpiece of Trump's trade policy. Tariffs must typically be approved by Congress, but the president says he has the power to act because the country's trade deficits amount to a national emergency. He imposed tariffs on most of the countries in the world at one point, sending markets reeling. You remember that? Liberation Day, April the 2nd. Now, markets have since then rebounded, but tariff threats continue by President Trump here. Let's take this back out live to the White House. You'll remember just over the Memorial Day weekend, he was threatening tariffs on the European Union. He was threatening tariffs on a specific multinational corporation, Apple, with the goal of Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, bringing more of this production of many of Apple's products back stateside to the United States here. So we're going to hopefully get some type of reaction from the White House. Remember, this was the video. Take a look at this on Liberation Day, April the 2nd. Now, we have been talking since then here on Live Now, I know I have, to so many economists and experts, that Congress historically had the role to levy tariffs, but through the intervening years, over decades, they ceded that role to the executive. And that is the law Trump is using to enact this. But this body, the Court of International Trade, is saying that he is violating that law, overstepping his authority. Now, the plaintiffs in this, the states, argued the emergency powers law does not authorize the use of tariffs. And even if it did, the trade deficit does not meet the law's requirement that an emergency be triggered only by a, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat. The United States has run a trade deficit with the rest of the world for about 49 consecutive years. We've been talking a lot about trade deficits. We've been talking a lot about trade surpluses and the like. So this is shaping up to be quite something. We'll be asking some of our economists, legal analysts, how this is all going to shake out. Now, remember, Trump imposed tariffs on most of the countries in the world in an effort to reverse America's massive and long-standing trade deficits. He earlier plastered levies on imports from Canada, China, and Mexico to combat the illegal flow of immigrants and synthetic opioids like precursor chemicals to make fentanyl across the border. Now, his administration argues the courts approved then-President Nixon's emergency use of tariffs in 1971, and that only Congress and not the courts can determine the quote-unquote political question of whether the president's rationale for declaring an emergency complies with the law. And that is a question for our legal analysts. Does having a trade deficit with the country constitute a national emergency that needs to be corrected? I want to put this up. Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays, the Democrat there, saying this. She's responding right now in real time. Big news. The U.S. Court of International Trade just struck down Trump's illegal tariff scheme as invalid under the IEEPA. She says the president does not have the authority to implement tariffs unilaterally. She says glad to have co-led this case with Oregon to protect Arizona families and small businesses.